Judge Andrew Napolitano. I told you I love Fox News. I disagree with almost everything on Fox News, but boy, that's a good network. They really present themselves. It's so entertaining. And I see Judge Andrew Napolitano on there all the time, and I look at this guy and I go, why couldn't I have hair like that? I'm bald. I've been bald since I was about 14 years old, Judge. So I'm very jealous of you. This guy has more. He has enough hair for two people. He has a book out called Theodore and Woodrow: How Two American Presidents Destroyed Constitutional Freedom, which is out now. One of his many books. This is a new one. Well, in a nutshell, Judge, how did they destroy constitutional freedom?
Well, first, let me thank you for having me on the show this morning. And second, let me thank you for your generous, gracious, a little bit of envious comments about my hair. These two presidents, we were all taught as kids that they were great men and even heroes, that one of them won, W-O-N, World War I, Roman numeral 1, and the other was a model of manliness and is on Mount Rushmore. In reality, they changed the world for the worse. So here's how it happened. With the exception of the Civil War, which was a very unique and unprecedented time in our history, every president from Washington to McKinley, who preceded Theodore Roosevelt, accepted the premise that the federal government was one of limited powers, that the Constitution authorized the federal government to do specific things, that the real engines of government were the states, that you could move from state to state if you didn't like the government in one state and wanted to go where there were fewer taxes or less government. And the federal government could only do what the Constitution authorized it to do. Woodrow Wilson and Theodore Roosevelt, who only met once, who hated each other, who ran against each other, Wilson beat him when he attempted to come back out of retirement, nevertheless shared the same value, and that value was the opposite of the one that was shared by all of their predecessors except Lincoln. Their view of the Constitution was it doesn't mean what it says. It doesn't limit the federal government. Rather, it unleashes the federal government to do whatever it wants except what is expressly prohibited. So as a result of this change in attitude, a 180-degree flip on the meaning of the federal government and its constitutional role in our lives, the government expands rapidly and dramatically and exponentially in the 16 years of their presidency. Where do they go to get the cash? Well, they institute a federal income tax, which they both said would never exceed 3%. We know where it is now. We know that it was up to 17% by the end of Wilson's presidency, and it was at 91% in FDR's time. They also went and established the Federal Reserve so that they could borrow money when it was inconvenient to raise taxes. Think about this. Woodrow Wilson borrowed $100 billion to fund World War I, a destructive and meaningless war, basically a battle amongst the last of Europe's monarchs over boundary lines. That $100 billion has not yet been repaid. We are still paying the interest on it 100 years later.
Now
they began this feeding frenzy of cash to fight wars and to redistribute to those less fortunate, and began us down the road of what is now $16 trillion in unsustainable debt.
Judge Napolitano, now this came up in the presidential election, this states' rights versus the federal government's role in things, and primarily in health care. And Obamacare, and people said, leave it up to the states to determine how to do health care, not the federal government. Now, could an argument be made, though, that some states like Mississippi, what kind of health care system do you think they would really be able to implement?
Okay, it's a great question, Rover. Prior to this progressive era, which is about 100 years ago, it starts at about 1900 and winds down at about 1920. But, of course, by 1920, these new government institutions were in place, and they're still in place today. Prior to the progressive era, the answer would be, this is not the obligation of the government. This is not in the Constitution, and the more the government takes care of people, whether it's food, shelter, clothing, education, or health care, the less people will be self-reliant. After the progressive era, everybody starts to look to the government to take care of them. The government can't afford to take care of them. The government does a lousy job at taking care of people. Everything the government runs, from Amtrak to Medicare to Medicaid to the post office to Social Security to the Mustang Ranch when they took that over, everything they own and operate, they run into the ground. It is simply not the job of Mississippi or the Department of Health and Human Services to take care of people's health. It's their own obligation to do it. If they can't because they're mentally deficient,
what about?
Or they absolutely can't because they're destitute. It's not the job of the feds to do it because it costs the feds $2 for every 50 cents they spend. It costs the states a lot less because they have a lot less infrastructure, bureaucratic infrastructure they have to pay for.
What about another way that it came up in this election, states' rights? Colorado and Washington legalizing marijuana, not just for medical marijuana. Everyone knows medical marijuana, that's hogwash. Everyone out in California has a medical marijuana card. None of them actually, are using it for medical purposes. But 2 states said, hey, you know what? We're not even going to try and perpetrate that fraud on people. We're just going to say, go ahead, it's legal, smoke weed. Now, the federal government still says it's illegal. Should it be, and how do you think that something has to be done in this case? What's going to happen?
It's also a great question, and it's an area on which I have spoken and written extensively. A little bit of history. The suppression of the idea that you can do what you want to your body begins in this era. So in this era is the first government regulation outlawing originally cocaine and then marijuana. It actually begins in a very racist way. If you read the language on the floor of the Congress in the Wilson administration, in the Wilson years during his presidency, because they didn't like what, quote, Mexicans were bringing in their pockets. Put aside the racism aspect. It results in prohibition, which is, of course, a disaster. So that's how this starts. Here's my opinion on Colorado and Washington. I have 3 opinions: constitutional, political, economic. Constitutionally, there's now a clash because marijuana is unlawful everywhere in the country for all purposes except certain laboratories are allowed to experiment with it. But in Colorado and in Washington, it is lawful. So it's going to be up to the federal government to decide what they want to do. Politically, in Colorado, a very interesting thing happened. The legislature rejected making marijuana legal, and the people went over the heads of their own elected representatives. To me, that is terrific.
And an eye-opener for maybe other politicians.
It shows the willingness of human beings to say to the government, don't tell us how to live our lives. Now, here's an interesting economic argument. The cheapest place in the country for marijuana will now be Washington and Colorado because it's not illegal. If every state in the union did this, or if half the states did this, it would make marijuana so cheap, it would reduce the demand for Mexican marijuana, which costs a fortune because you have to pay a premium to fight law enforcement. If stated differently, if marijuana were legal in this country for private, personal, in-the-house use, not talking about while you're driving a car or even in front of your kids, that's another issue. It would put the violent, lethal Mexican cartels out of business overnight because there would be no market for their product.
How long is the federal government on the hot seat to resolve this issue? How long will it take?
To decide what to do. Now, here's what they did with medical marijuana. They picked and chose where to enforce and where not. For example, they raided with guns drawn, literally, medical marijuana dispensaries in San Francisco and Oakland. These are lawful dispensaries operating under the authority of the state of California. They raided it with guns drawn. They didn't arrest anybody, but they confiscated the profits and they confiscated the product. In Montclair, New Jersey, where Chris Christie has a new friend in the White House named Barack Obama, medical marijuana is sold openly and notoriously, and the feds don't interfere. So that's a very serious problem because the federal government is restrained by a clause in the Constitution called the Equal Protection Clause, which basically means it must treat similarly situated people in a similar way. It can't decide to enforce federal law in California but not enforce it in New Jersey. It either must enforce it everywhere or nowhere.
And I would guess that someone who's popped for that in California could make a case all the way to the Supreme Court, say, wait a second, I shouldn't be punished for this if guys in New Jersey aren't being punished for this.
Absolutely. So this is a difficult decision that the president will have to wrestle with. And initially, Attorney General Holder said, we're not going to interfere with medical marijuana. We're taking a different position from the Bush administration. And then they changed their minds and without notice shut these places down in Northern California, not in Los Angeles and not in New Jersey. So there really doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason as to how the government decides when and where and against whom to enforce its laws. This creates instability and uncertainty, which the Constitution was written to prevent.
Judge Andrew Napolitano, his book, Theodore and Woodrow, How Two American Presidents Destroyed Constitutional Freedom. I know you have to run. Listen, I've got to get you back on next book you put out, or even sooner. Forget it. I could talk to you for half an hour.
Can I tell you, it's a joy and it's a good time of day for me, and I'm happy to do this anytime you want.
And you must be really happy that Notre Dame, where you went to law school,
oh my goodness,
they're playing for the national championship.
Like it was back when I was there. To be a student in a university when that university wins a national championship in basketball or football is an experience you'll never forget. And in the 3 years I was there for law school, I won't tell you the year because it's probably before you guys were born. They did have a national football championship, and I believe they're going to have one again. It's absolutely remarkable. Of course, economically for the school, it's fantastic. They could build a new library with the income that will come in from a national football championship.
I'll bet when they did that, you were smoking a lot of weed in celebration, weren't you, Judge?
It was unlawful then.
Oh, really?
And because I knew I was going to become a judge, I took an oath to obey the law, even if I disagreed with it.
Judge Andrew Napolitano. Yeah, now that he's not a judge, now he's like, forget it. Now I can do whatever I want. Judge Napolitano, thank you. Good luck with the book, Theodore and Woodrow, and we'll have you on again sometime soon, my man.
Thank you, guys. Have a good one.
Thank you. I like that guy.